Shortly after the general election, the coalition government invited all schools, secondary, primary and special, to apply for academy status, with a special fast-track route for those already graded outstanding by Ofsted. The first of those schools to convert are now up and running. So how are they doing, and how many more will follow in their footsteps? Watford Grammar School for Boys may look familiar. It's where The History Boys was filmed. And now this partially selective, voluntary aided school is in the limelight again, as one of the 32 schools to convert to academy status in time for the start of the new academic year. So Martin, you were one of the very first schools to convert to academy and really did it over the summer. Was it a fantastically busy summer sorting it all out?
We had a governors' meeting on the 10th of August, which decided that we would go full steam ahead. Probably took 10 weeks of really hard work over the summer. And really, for 6 weeks of those, we were still not sure whether we were going to go or not.
And what for you was the big motivation?
I think that the school has always wanted to be as independent as possible within the state sector. The financial aspect has to be taken into account. And although the local authority, Hertfordshire, probably top sliced less than most local authorities, there was still a substantial amount of money coming back to us, which I feel I could use better than them.
Can you give us some idea how much better off you are?
It's about £380,000. I mean, obviously we have to deduct from that the kind of things that we will be paying for.
The Academy's bill became law within 3 months of the general election. After changes made in Parliament, the law allows schools that convert new freedoms to set their own curriculum, as long as it's broad and balanced, to administer their own admissions within the admissions code, to set pay and conditions for their staff, to change the length of the school day and term, and to receive their share of the money normally held back by councils for central services. Although mainly about granting new freedoms to schools, the Academies Act also imposes some constraints, requiring new academies to have at least 2 parent governors, to promote community cohesion with encouragement to support other schools, to appoint a special needs coordinator, and to comply with obligations to meet pupils' special needs. Before the summer, we visited another outstanding school considering becoming an academy, this time a primary. At that time, the executive principal, Greg Wallace, who runs Woodbury as part of a federation with 2 other primary schools, was still unsure whether he'd go ahead. Is it clear yet how much extra money you would get?
No, it's not clear at all. I mean, we're all thinking 10%, but I've no idea, and finding out for definite how much money is important.
It's now a few months later, and I've come back to ask Greg whether he has more information. Greg, when we last met, you were still a bit uncertain about whether or not to go ahead with applying for academy status. You still had some unanswered questions. Have things changed?
Yeah, they've moved on a lot. I think one of the things I was unsure about was VAT, what would happen there. I've now got an answer to that, to get the money back. I was unsure about what would happen to us as a federation. I'm now clear that all 3 schools can move forward to be academies together. And I was unsure about how much money we'd get, and I'm now much clearer about that too.
So how much extra money will you get?
We'd get, for this school, would be down £250,000 extra, same for London Fields, more or less, and about £200,000 for Mandeville. So between us, that would be £750,000 extra per year. That's the thing that does really kind of drive us.
Because Woodbury is part of a federation, it's able to share services across its 3 schools to save money. However, all schools becoming academies, including Greg's, will have to pay for educational psychologists and SEN services, behavioural support, HR and payroll services, and administrative support on admissions. Going back to funding, what will you be doing with that extra money?
Well, I think that it's no secret that we're moving into a time of real financial turbulence, and I'm working on the basis that my budget will be reduced, or we are going to reduce the budget by 10%. So that will be roughly £500,000 coming out of the budget next year. Now, obviously, the money, the resources that we have that used to go to the local authorities will, to some extent, help us to meet that cut. It doesn't mean that we're going to be gold-plating the taps or anything like that, but it does mean that we perhaps are not going to be forced into some of the extreme measures that some other schools would have to contemplate.
A big question for school staff is what will happen to pay and conditions, as academies have freedom to vary these.
In the early days, the academies will probably try to increase teachers' pay in very specific areas. So they need a good head of maths, and they know there's a good head of maths in a school down the road, so they will offer him the teachers TLR plus. And so there will be a kind of Premier League type poaching of the best teachers and the best deputy heads and so on.
If all schools, or a majority of secondary schools, go down that route, I suspect relatively little in practice will actually change. But it may be that there will be some things like pay and conditions of service that will cease to be national, and that in some parts of the country we'll end up with a much lower paid staff because costs are lower out in some areas than they are in the centre.
However, there are constraints imposed by what's known as the TUPE regulations, which largely guarantee that staff moving from their old employer to the new one are protected. However, academies can set their own pay levels for newly recruited staff.
Well, I mean, the TUPE restrictions are really important to bear in mind. I have to be quite careful that anything that I do, I have to put through the filter of saying, is this a measure under TUPE? Because I need to be very, very clear that I'm not changing things for the staff. However, in the future, obviously, there are flexibilities that one can avail oneself of. But at the moment, what I want is I want to keep an excellent staff, and I want to keep an excellent staff as happy as I can.
The Academy Trust that's set up when schools make the conversion is technically a charitable company limited by guarantee. This places legal obligations on the governors, which are similar to those on directors of any other company. Company directors are personally liable if that company continues to trade when it's insolvent. Because many local authority pension schemes are in deficit, many school governors are concerned about their liabilities if they change to become an academy.
Now, what about pensions? I know there's no change for teachers, but for support staff there is a concern about what happens to the pensions liability. What is their position?
Yeah, the local government pension scheme deficit is one of the issues that I know that worries a lot of schools. The advice is that before a school converts, you have an actuarial assessment of the deficit for your particular school. The actuarial assessment will give you an employer's contribution so that over the next 20 years that deficit is reduced to zero. The deficit sits on the Academy's books, but there is an agreement between the DFE and the Charity Commission that you will not be a company trading whilst insolvent. But it will sit there, and it obviously looks a bit ugly.
The school, along with other academies, has also received an undertaking in a letter from the Minister, Lord Hill, that if the deficit is called in, then the Department for Education will make a grant to cover the costs.
The New Academies programme is a step change from the one created by the last government, which focused on a relatively small number of underperforming or even failing schools. Potentially the new programme could extend to the great majority of schools, and that would mean big changes for local authorities. As you're probably aware, some people have raised concerns about what it means for those schools that are left behind still with the local authority, particularly if schools like your own, which may not have a big call on some things like special needs or behavioural support. What's your response to that?
I think it is a concern. What I do have to say is, though, that we've been being tithed for a number of years and not receiving anything like the same amount of services back as we've been paying for. So we have been subsidising the system for a number of years.
What if some other event overtook the school? For example, a fire burnt down your buildings. In the past, the local authority would be there as backup and support, might find alternative accommodation while the school is rebuilt. What would happen now you're an academy?
Well, that's an interesting area. I mean, I hope we don't prove to be a test case, but eventually there's going to be one. And the local authorities still have a responsibility to make sure that students are educated. We have to take out insurance, and we have to make sure that our insurance is adequate. But at the moment, I couldn't tell you where the funding stream is that I would tap into to have that kind of replacement.
There are clearly some things that you need a local body to be in charge of: special needs funding, exclusions. What happens if a school burns down? So my view is that the model whereby 100% of funding is being devolved to schools is not quite the right model. They need to change that and devolve 95% or 98% or whatever it may be. Beyond that, I've never been clear what this amazing array of services that everyone talks about is. The stated £250,000 that this one school would get extra per year, we do not receive £250,000 worth of services from the local authority. We don't. End of.
I know that not everybody thinks very highly of everything that the local authority does. I recognise that there are, good local authorities and not so good, but the local authority system is what needs, I think, to be protected. If it accelerates, and if we have all schools becoming academies, then my forecast is that after a while, 20,000 schools answerable to the Secretary of State won't work. So the schools will voluntarily cluster together into consortia and organise things like procurement of services through consortia, and that will need to be paid for. And before long, you will actually recreate a kind of pseudo-local authority, but without the democratic input. And that is my nightmare scenario.
There are risks involved in the Academy's policy, and one of those is that perhaps unintentionally there could be greater power moving to the centre, with the Secretary of State directly responsible for hundreds, even thousands of schools. But ministers say that's not their intention. They hope that greater autonomy for schools and greater competition between them will help raise standards generally. In the next Need to Know, we're at Westminster for the announcement of the Comprehensive Spending Review, when we'll be finding out what lies ahead for school funding.